The basic idea of a debt for climate swap or debt for nature swap is that the country exchanges some debt for a commitment to invest either on climate or on nature preservation. So, for example, if a creditor has a debt claim on the country, the creditor would agree to write down the debt in exchange for such climate or conservation commitment. That would be the simplest type of swap. What we can also have is a situation where a donor doesn't have a claim on the country but would like to facilitate such type of transaction, and then it can either go and buy a debt claim on the country, which can then swap with the debtor, or it can try to facilitate a transaction whereby it provides some type of credit enhancement, and that way allows the country to issue debt at more favorable terms than it would otherwise would be able to issue to then exchange for its existing debt, and in the process generate some savings in terms of how much it will cost to service a debt, which can then be used to help meet the climate or expenditure commitments that the country is taking as part of the swap. So the debt for nature swaps have been around for quite some time, since the 1980s. There have been a number of transactions, but they tend to be fairly small transactions. It has remained a fairly niche type of instrument, in part because of the costs associated with setting up the transactions and monitoring. There is some renewed interest on the topic, especially because of the question of climate. A lot of countries seem to have significant climate vulnerabilities and debt vulnerabilities, and then the idea whether we should try to, in a sense, combine two problems and try to bundle the solution. And so there has been renewed interest on this, and there have been a few recent transactions that are slightly larger in scale, relatively speaking, which can also help inform future deals. So there have been two recent transactions. One in the case of Belize, where in both TNC was involved in Belize, where they issued a blue bond to buy back the entire stock of their sole euro bond. And then in the case of Barbados, there was also another blue bond issuance with, and in both cases involved marine conservation commitments. So there are some elements which can then be used to see what seem to have worked on these cases, and then can help inform future transactions. So there are a number of conditions. I mean, there needs to be suitable projects for either the climate or the conservation commitment. So there has to be a country where these issues seem to be particularly relevant to identify suitable projects. We also, in our working paper, we mentioned that we see this as more relevant for countries where debt is sustainable, but where there is limited fiscal space to undertake climate or nature expenditures. So if a country's debt is unsustainable, then we think it probably would make much more sense to just focus on restructuring the debt and restoring that sustainability. In a sense, adding this swap dimension can risk complicating what is already a fairly complicated process. So we tend to see swaps as being more useful when sustainability is not an issue, but there's still limited fiscal resources, which hopefully the swap can help free up some additional resources to meet those expenditures. So swaps is only one instrument among many other options, and some instruments, for example, climate conditional grant, could be designed in the way, if the idea is for a donor to provide more resources for a given expenditure to be met. Maybe a conditional grant could be a simpler way to structure the transaction, and could be simpler to administer. It could be also simpler to make sure that the resources are used for the intended purposes. The case for a swap on purely efficiency grounds tends to be relatively narrow, but there might be a broader pragmatic case for using swaps, particularly if we feel that grants are not on the table, but a swap might be. In effect, a lot of the interest on swap seems to come from countries which see very limited opportunities for receiving grants, but they see there might be more support for a donor-financed swap. In the end of the day, the idea is to structure a transaction in a way to generate some savings for the country. So, for example, buying back debt that is fairly expensive or that is trading at a discount by issuing cheaper debt, for example, or that is sold at a more favorable terms for the country. That is unlikely that the debtor can do that on its own. For example, if this debt is trading at distressed prices, presumably it's because the country has some challenges and is not able to issue that at favorable terms. So usually the savings, so to speak, on that service will have to come either through a donor providing a direct subsidy, or through a donor providing some type of credit enhancement, for example, a guarantee that then makes the new debt more attractive to investors and allow the country to issue more cheaply and then buy the more expensive debt, and then in the process generate the savings needed to undertake the climate or the conservation expenditures. But the broad issues are well understood, but I think it's really important to really go into the details of each transaction, because that's where things need to be looked at carefully to make sure that the transaction is indeed generating savings. So, for example, keeping fees low or any penalty or any other costs that might be associated with the transaction low. Try to make the buyback, if there is a buyback involved, engineer it to get a favorable terms for the debtor, and sort of try to maximize the savings. And if there's any type of credit enhancement or guarantee being provided, also be mindful that could become costly to the debtor if it ever needs to restructure. It could, because you may be replacing what is more expensive debt, but it may also be easier to restructure that with a debt that has a guarantee that may become more tricky if it comes to pass that the country does need to restructure its debt in the future. So there's a lot of considerations to be taken into account, and you really need to look on a case-by-case basis to see whether it makes sense. I've been working with colleagues on a working paper looking at this question of debt for climate swaps and how they can be effective. And the basic idea for them to be effective is that you need to have a financial transaction that, in the end of the day, generates some savings for the country. So, for example, you're swapping what is an expensive debt claim with a cheaper debt claim, or if you get an outright debt write-down from a creditor that wants to encourage these investments, and in exchange just give you a write on the debt. The country on its own cannot, presumably, not swap its existing debt for anything that much more attractive, because if you were to issue new debt, we'll probably face the same interest rates that its current debt is facing at the secondary market. So to be able to issue cheaper debt, you either need to have a donor give a direct subsidy, for example, or provide some type of enhancement on the debt that then other would-be investors would find it more attractive. So, for example, provide a guarantee that if the country was ever in need to restructure its debts, then this new debt claim would somehow benefit from the guarantee, and that can make the debt more trade at a higher price than its existing debt. But on the flip side, the country also needs to be mindful that these enhancements could come at a cost. For example, if you ever needs to restructure, the guarantee would kick in, and that could potentially complicate a future restructuring, depending on the nature of the guarantee and who's providing it. Very significant fixed costs and first mover costs. So part of the hope is that as more transactions take place, then the the nature of the transactions becomes better understood by all parties involved, so including would-be donors, would-be recipients, and even the investors that might ultimately buy the whatever green or blue bond is being issued as part of the swap. So as these transactions become better understood, maybe some of the costs might come down. Generally, swaps tend to be more useful for countries where that is sustainable, but there's still limited fiscal space to meet this pressing climate and conservation needs. Because if a country's debt is unsustainable, we tend to think that then what the country really needs is a debt restructuring that can restore its debt to sustainability. Maybe in theory the swap could facilitate things, but I think in practice there's this fear that it would risk complicating what is already a fairly complicated process involved in restructuring debt when that is unsustainable. But that also leaves a very large number of countries, because maybe most countries out there have sustainable debts, but they're still facing quite limited fiscal space. So there's a very large pool of potential countries that could benefit from these transactions if there is the willingness on the part of the would-be donors to finance these transactions, and if opportunities can be found where it makes financial sense and it makes sense from the particular situations of the countries where it would be a good candidate for, say, a climate adaptation or for a particular conservation project. So the recent transactions on Belize and Barbados, they are quite similar, and maybe by design, because they were facilitated by both by TNC. The case of Belize might be more unique because it involved buying back the entire stock of its sole trading bond, and then in the process they could use features such as the collective action clauses in that bond to buy the bond at a determined price, which could be more difficult to do if you are doing that in the context of a country that is not restructuring the debt, or where you don't want to necessarily use those clauses to avoid triggering a credit event. Maybe for the particular cases, to get a details on the cases, you're probably better off speaking to other people, like the people that either set up the transaction or even within the fund, to the respective country teams would have a more granular view.